The first time Greshka heard Xander Kellerman speak, she had been bracing herself for the same fury every other human had shown her kind, but his voice came soft as summer rain against thatch, and it confused her more than any shout ever could. She stood at the edge of his property just after dawn, her green skin covered in dust from 3 days of walking, her small tusks catching the early light as she tried to decide whether to risk approaching the ranch house or move on to the next territory. The war had ended 6 months ago, but the hatred hadn't, and orc refugees like herself were still being driven from town after town, blamed for crimes committed by armies she'd never joined. Her shoulder bore a poorly healed wound from a farmer's pitchfork 2 weeks back, and her supplies had run out yesterday. She was desperate enough to beg, and that desperation tasted like ash in her mouth. The ranch itself sprawled across a valley between 2 gentle hills, with pastures full of cattle and sheep, a sturdy house built from local timber, and several outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful management. Smoke rose from the chimney, meaning someone was awake. Greshka's stomach cramped with hunger, and she made her decision, stepping onto the property with her hands raised to show she carried no weapons. She'd barely made it 20 paces when a man emerged from the barn carrying a bucket in one hand. He was tall, perhaps in his early 30s, with brown hair that fell to his collar and the weathered face of someone who spent his days under the sun. He wore simple work clothes, sturdy boots, and moved with the easy confidence of a man on his own land. When he spotted her, he stopped, and Greshka tensed, waiting for the shout, the anger, the inevitable chase. Instead, Xander simply set down his bucket and regarded her with steady gray eyes that held no malice, only cautious curiosity. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them, but pitched at a conversational level, as though they were neighbors meeting on a road rather than strangers of warring species. Greshka's prepared speech tangled in her throat. She'd been ready for hostility, for violence even, but this quiet acknowledgement left her fumbling. "I am passing through," she managed, her accent thick around the human words. "I do not mean trouble. I only hope to trade work for food if you have any to spare." Xander tilted his head slightly, considering. His gaze traveled over her, taking in the torn shirt, the way she favored her right side, the hollow look that came from too many hungry days. "You're hurt," he observed, still in that same calm tone. "It is nothing," Greshka said automatically, the pride of her people demanding she show no weakness. "Looks like something from here," Xander replied, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he bent to retrieve his bucket, and Greshka's hand instinctively went to her hip where a blade would have hung if she still owned one. Xander noticed the gesture and moved slowly, deliberately, giving her time to see that he meant no threat. "Have you eaten?" The question was so simple, so human in its basic kindness, that Greshka felt something crack inside her chest. "Not for 2 days," she admitted, hating how the words revealed her vulnerability. Xander nodded as if she'd told him something mundane like the weather forecast. "Come on up to the house then. I've got breakfast cooking, and there's more than enough for 2. He turned and began walking toward the ranch house without looking back to see if she followed, as though her acceptance was a foregone conclusion. Greshka stood frozen for several heartbeats, her mind racing through possibilities. This could be a trap, some elaborate cruelty that would end with her in chains or worse. But she was so tired, so hungry, and there had been something in his eyes that looked almost like decency. She followed, keeping a careful distance, her every sense alert for danger. The interior of the ranch house was clean and well-maintained, with simple wooden furniture and the kind of organized efficiency that spoke of a solitary man who took care of his space. The kitchen smelled of bacon and fresh bread, and Greshka's stomach clenched so hard she nearly doubled over. Xander gestured to a chair at the sturdy table. "Sit, this will be ready in a minute." She sat, perching on the edge of the chair, ready to bolt. Xander moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, plating eggs and bacon, cutting thick slices of bread, pouring water from a pitcher. He set a full plate in front of her, added a cup of water, and then took his own seat across the table with a similar plate. "Go ahead," he said when she didn't immediately reach for the food. Greshka ate, trying to maintain some dignity but ultimately giving in to her hunger and devouring the meal with desperate efficiency. Xander ate his own breakfast at a normal pace, not watching her directly, but not ignoring her presence either. The silence between them wasn't hostile, just cautious, two beings trying to figure out what this moment meant. When she'd finished, wiping the last of the egg from her plate with bread, Greshka sat back and met his eyes. Why, she asked, the word encompassing everything. Why feed her? Why show kindness? Why not turn her away like everyone else? Xander took a sip of his water, considering his answer. My father used to say that a man's character isn't measured by how he treats his equals, but by how he treats those who can't do anything for him in return. He set down his cup. You said you'd work for food. I've got plenty of work if you're interested. You would hire an orc? Greshka couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. I'd hire someone who needs work and is willing to do it, Xander corrected gently. What you are doesn't change that you're a person standing in my kitchen who clearly needs help. It was such a radical statement, delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone, that Greshka didn't know how to respond. In her experience, humans saw orcs as monsters first and individuals never. What kind of work? She asked, forcing herself to be practical even as something warm and unfamiliar unfurled in her chest. Depends on what you can do, Xander said. I run cattle and sheep, do some crop farming, and handle all the maintenance on the buildings and equipment. I could use help with just about anything, but that shoulder needs tending first. He stood, moving to a cabinet and pulling out a wooden box. I've got medical supplies. Will you let me look at it? Every instinct screamed at Greshka to refuse, to not show vulnerability to a human, but the wound had been getting worse, hot to the touch and painful in a way that suggested infection. She nodded stiffly, and with clumsy fingers, unfastened the buttons of her torn shirt enough to ease it off her injured shoulder. The wound was ugly, 3 puncture marks that had scabbed over but showed signs of festering around the edges. Xander made a small sound of sympathy, not disgust, and retrieved a bowl of clean water and some cloth. This is going to hurt, he warned, his voice gentle, and then he began cleaning the wound with careful, competent hands. Greshka bit down on her tusks to keep from crying out, her muscles rigid with pain and the strange vulnerability of letting someone tend to her. Xander worked with steady focus, cleaning away the infection, applying some kind of herbal paste that stung viciously, and then bandaging the shoulder with strips of clean linen. Through it all, he narrated what he was doing in that same calm voice, as though talking to a nervous animal he was trying to soothe. There, he said finally, securing the bandage, that should start healing properly now. You'll want to keep it clean and dry, change the dressing every day. The paste is yarrow and honey, helps fight infection. He cleaned up the supplies, giving her time to refasten her shirt and regain her composure. Thank you, Greshka managed, the words feeling inadequate but sincere. Xander just nodded. Now, about that work. You're in no shape for heavy labor today, but I could use help in the garden if you're up for it. Weeding, mostly. Nothing that'll stress that shoulder too much. And so began what Greshka had assumed would be a single day of work for food that stretched instead, into a week, then 2, then a month. Xander never explicitly asked her to stay longer, but each evening he would mention some task for the next day, in that same conversational tone, and each morning Greshka would wake in the small guest room he'd offered her and find herself unable to leave. The ranch work was hard but satisfying, and Xander proved to be a patient teacher for the tasks Greshka didn't know. He showed her how to milk the goats, how to mend fences, how to check the sheep for parasites and treat them. He explained his crop rotation plans, his breeding program for the cattle, his water management system, and through it all, he never once raised his voice. That was what struck Greshka most deeply as the days passed. She'd grown up in an orc clan where volume equaled authority, where warriors proved their dominance through intimidation and bellowing commands. Human society, from what she'd seen during and after the war, operated similarly with shouting and anger as tools of control. But Xander ran his entire ranch with quiet words and steady example. When a bull broke through a fence, destroying hours of work, Xander surveyed the damage and said calmly, "Well, that's frustrating. Let's get him secured before he leads the others out." No cursing, no throwing things, just practical problem solving. When a summer storm damaged part of the barn roof and rain ruined a store of hay, Xander climbed up to assess the repairs needed and called down, "Could you hand me that hammer?" We'll need to get this patched before the next rain. No rage at the loss, just action. Even when Greshka herself made mistakes, and she made several in those early weeks, unfamiliar with ranch work and sometimes misjudging her own healing strength, Xander never yelled. When she accidentally left a gate unlatched and 3 sheep wandered off, requiring hours of searching to recover them, he simply said, "It happens. We all forget things when we're learning. Just double-check the gates from now on, and we'll be fine." His patience was maddening sometimes, because Greshka kept waiting for the other boot to drop, for the moment when his temper would finally show itself, and she'd understand what he really thought of having an orc on his property. But that moment never came. Instead, something stranger happened. As summer deepened and the work fell into a comfortable rhythm, Greshka found herself actually enjoying her time on the ranch. She took pride in the garden flourishing under her care, in the way the animals began to recognize and trust her, in the skills she was developing. More confusing still, she found herself looking forward to the evenings when she and Xander would eat dinner together and talk. Those conversations revealed a man far more complex than the quiet rancher she'd first met. Xander had fought in the war, she learned, serving in the cavalry unit of the Regional Defense Force. He spoke little of the combat itself, but mentioned that the experience had taught him the value of peace and the cost of violence. He'd inherited the ranch from his father, who died the winter before the war began, and had built it into its current prosperity through years of careful work. "Did you hate us?" Greshka asked one evening, the question emerging before she could think better of it. "During the war, did you hate the orcs?" Xander set down his fork, giving the question serious consideration. "I hated what was happening," he said finally. "I hated seeing friends die, hated being away from the ranch, hated that we couldn't find a way to solve things without bloodshed. But hate an entire people?" He shook his head. "My father taught me that hate is a poison you drink yourself while hoping someone else suffers. I saw enough orc soldiers showing mercy, enough humans showing cruelty, to know that good and evil aren't determined by which side you're born on." It was the longest speech Greshka had heard him make, and every word landed in her chest with unexpected weight. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," she said quietly. "He was," Xander agreed, a note of old grief in his voice. "I try to live by what he taught me, though I don't always succeed." "You succeed more than most," Greshka said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. As the weeks turned into months, Greshka's shoulder healed completely, leaving only faint scars behind. She grew stronger from the work, her muscles adapting to the physical demands of ranch life, her skin darkening slightly from the sun. She learned to anticipate Xander's needs, to work alongside him with the kind of wordless coordination that comes from extended partnership. They developed private jokes, comfortable silences, and a friendship that Greshka had never expected to find with a human. But friendship wasn't quite the right word anymore, and Greshka knew it even as she tried to deny what she was feeling. It was there in the way her heartbeat quickened when Xander smiled at her, in the way she found herself watching him when he worked, admiring the competent way he handled tools and animals, the quiet strength in his frame, in the way his rare laughter made something warm bloom in her chest. She was falling in love with him, and it was the most foolish thing she could possibly do. The realization crystallized one evening in early autumn when they were bringing the cattle down from the high pasture before the weather turned. A late-season storm had blown in unexpectedly, bringing driving rain and wind that made the cattle nervous and difficult to manage. Greshka was soaked through, struggling to keep a group of calves moving in the right direction, when one broke away and bolted toward a steep ravine. Without thinking, she lunged for the calf, managing to grab it but losing her own footing in the process. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, felt the sickening lurch of falling, and then strong hands caught her arm and hauled her back from the edge. Xander pulled her to safety, keeping one arm around her waist to steady her while his other hand maintained his grip on her arm. They stood there in the pouring rain, both breathing hard, and Greshka looked up to find his face inches from hers, his gray eyes dark with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. And even through the storm his voice was gentle, controlled, focused entirely on her well-being rather than the near disaster. "Yes," Greshka managed, acutely aware of his arm around her. of his warmth against her side, of the way he was looking at her like she mattered more than cattle or calves or anything else in that moment. "You scared me," Xander admitted, and there was something raw in his voice, something that went beyond employer, worrying about employee, or even friend concerned for friend. They stood there for a heartbeat longer, something electric passing between them, and then Xander carefully released her and stepped back. "Let's get these animals secured and get inside," he said, his voice returning to its usual calm, but Greshka had heard the tremor beneath it, had felt his hands shake slightly before he let her go. That night, drying off by the kitchen fire, Greshka forced herself to confront what she'd been avoiding. She cared for Xander deeply, more than was wise, and unless she was badly misreading the signs, he felt something for her too. But what future could possibly exist for a human and an orc? The war might be over, but the prejudices that had fueled it remained strong. Humans still viewed orcs with suspicion and hatred, and orc clans considered any of their people who fraternized with humans to be traitors. "You're thinking too loud," Xander observed from his seat across the kitchen table, where he was oiling a harness that needed repair. Greshka looked up, startled. "What?" "You get this expression when you're working through something difficult in your head," he said, small smile playing at his lips. "Like you're having an argument with yourself and both sides are making good points." Despite herself, Greshka felt an answering smile tug at her mouth. "I was thinking that I have been here for 3 months now," she said carefully, "much longer than I intended." Something flickered in Xander's eyes, there and gone too quickly for her to read. "You're welcome to stay as long as you want," he said, focusing on the harness in his hands. "You've more than earned your place here. You're the best help I've ever had, and that's not flattery, just fact." "Is that all I am?" The question emerged before Greshka could stop it, vulnerable and probing, and she immediately wished she could take it back. Xander's hands stilled on the leather. He set down the harness carefully and met her eyes. "No," he said simply, "you're a friend, a good friend, actually. Maybe the best friend I've had since before the war. This place feels different with you here, feels less lonely. I look forward to the work because I get to do it with you. I look forward to dinner because I get to talk with you." He paused, and Greshka's heart hammered in her chest. "Is that all I am to you?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Greshka thought about lying, about protecting herself and him from the complications that honesty would bring. But Xander had shown her nothing but truth since the day they'd met, and he deserved the same from her. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are much more than that." The silence that followed was charged with electricity. Xander stood slowly, moving around the table to stand before her. Greshka rose to meet him, her pulse racing. They were close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, could count the small scars on his hands from years of ranch work. "Greshka," he said, her name sounding like something precious in his mouth. "I don't know how this happened, and I know it's complicated, but I need you to know that I have feelings for you. Real feelings, the kind that keep me up at night, wondering if you might feel the same way." "I do," Greshka breathed. "I feel the same way, Xander, but this is impossible. Your people hate mine. My people would call me a traitor. How can we—" "I don't care what anyone else thinks," Xander interrupted, and though his voice didn't rise, there was steel in it now, a fierce determination Greshka had never heard before. "I care about you. I care about what we've built here together. I care about the fact that I'm happier with you around than I've been in years. That's what matters." "It is not that simple," Greshka protested, even as her heart soared at his words. "People will not accept us. We would face hatred, violence possibly, then we'll face it together," Xander said, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hand. His palm was warm and calloused, gentle against her green skin. "I'm not saying it will be easy. I'm saying it will be worth it, because you're worth it." Greshka felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the quiet certainty in his voice, by the way he looked at her like she was something treasured rather than something to be feared or despised. "I am afraid," she admitted. "So am I," Xander said and smiled. "But I'd rather be afraid with you than safe without you." She kissed him then, or maybe he kissed her, or perhaps they moved together simultaneously. It didn't matter. What mattered was the way his arms came around her, solid and sure, the way his lips moved against hers with a tenderness that made her chest ache. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and Greshka answered by wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said simply. "Not as help, not as a friend. Stay with me as whatever we can be to each other." "Yes," Greshka whispered, the word feeling like a promise and a prayer. Yes. They might have stayed like that indefinitely, wrapped in each other, and the fragile new reality they'd just acknowledged, but a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. They broke apart, and Greshka saw wariness flash across Xander's face as he moved toward the door. Visitors were rare on the isolated ranch, and late-night visits never brought good news. Xander opened the door to reveal 3 men standing on the porch, all wearing the rough clothes of farmhands or laborers. Greshka recognized the type immediately, the kind of men who'd been chasing her from town to town, looking for someone to blame for the war's disruptions. "Xander Kellerman?" the foremost man asked, though his eyes had already found Greshka, standing in the kitchen and narrowed with hatred. "That's right," Xander said, his voice neutral but his body language shifting subtly to place himself between the men and Greshka. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" "We're from the settlement down valley," the man said. "Been hearing rumors that you're harboring an orc up here. Came to see if it's true." "Miss Greshka works for me," Xander said calmly. "She helps run the ranch. I don't see how that's anyone's business but mine." "It's everyone's business when there's a monster living among decent folk," another man spat. "These greenskins killed my brother during the war. They're dangerous, and they got no place here." "The war is over," Xander said, and though his voice remained level, Greshka could hear the steel beneath it. "Miss Greshka is a civilian who had nothing to do with military actions. She works hard, minds her own business, and has every right to be here." "You're either a fool or a traitor, Kellerman," the first man said. "We know how orcs operate. She's probably spelled you or waiting for a chance to slit your throat in your sleep. We're here to help you, whether you realize you need it or not." The men moved as if to enter the house, and Greshka tensed, preparing for a fight. But Xander didn't step aside. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, and Greshka recognized the movement from her own combat training, the subtle weight distribution of someone ready to fight. "No one is entering my property without invitation," Xander said, and now there was an edge to his voice, sharp as a knife. Not louder, still controlled, but carrying an unmistakable warning. "Miss Greshka is under my protection, and I don't take kindly to threats against people I care about. I'm going to ask you once, politely, to leave my land." "And if we don't?" the third man asked, his hand moving toward his belt where Greshka could see a knife hanging. "Then you'll be trespassing, and I'm within my rights to defend my property," Xander said. "I've got a loaded rifle 10 feet from where I'm standing, and I'm a very good shot. I really don't want things to go that direction, but I will protect what's mine." The men exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this level of resistance. The first man's expression hardened. "You've got a week, Kellerman. 1 week to get that orc off your property, or we'll be back with more men and we'll handle this properly. Think about what's more important to you, one greenskin or your whole operation here." "I don't need a week to know what matters to me," Xander said quietly, "and I don't respond well to threats. Now get off my land before I stop being polite." The men left, but their departure felt more like a tactical retreat than an actual concession. Xander stood in the doorway, watching until their lanterns disappeared into the distance before finally closing the door and turning back to Greshka. She expected to see regret in his eyes, or fear, or the kind of practical calculation that would lead him to realize she needed to leave for his own safety. Instead, she saw anger not at her but on her behalf and a fierce protectiveness that made her breath catch. "I am sorry," Greshka said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I am bringing trouble to you. Maybe I should leave before." "No." The word was flat, absolute. Xander crossed the room and took her hands in his. "Don't even finish that sentence. You're not leaving, and you're not responsible for the bigotry of small-minded people." "They will come back," Greshka said, "and next time there will be more of them. They could destroy everything you have built here." "Let them try," Xander said and squeezed her hands. "I meant what I said before. I'm not losing you, because some people can't see past their prejudices. We'll figure this out. How? Greshka asked, fighting against the hope and fear warring in her chest. We cannot fight an entire settlement. Xander was quiet for a moment, thinking. We need allies, he said finally. People who'll stand with us, make it clear that this isn't just one isolated rancher they can intimidate. There are other ranchers in the area, some I served with during the war. Good people who might see reason. Or they might side with the mob, Greshka pointed out. Maybe, Xander acknowledged, but I have to believe that there are more decent people in this world than hateful ones. We just have to find them. Over the next several days, Xander made visits to neighboring ranches, leaving Greshka behind with strict instructions to stay armed and alert. Each evening he returned with mixed news. Some neighbors had been openly hostile, agreeing with the sentiment that orcs didn't belong among humans. Others had been nervously non-committal, clearly sympathetic but unwilling to risk their own standing in the community. But a blessed, crucial few had listened to Xander's defense of Greshka's character and agreed to at least come meet her before passing judgment. The first to visit was Marcus Kendrick, a grizzled veteran who'd served in Xander's cavalry unit. He arrived on horseback, alone, and studied Greshka with the wary assessment of a soldier evaluating a potential threat. Marcus, this is Greshka, Xander introduced them, his voice carrying quiet pride. Greshka, Marcus is an old friend and one of the best men I know. Madam, Marcus said, tipping his hat with gruff courtesy. Sir, Greshka replied, meeting his eyes steadily and resisting the urge to look away first. Marcus spent the afternoon watching Greshka work, asking pointed questions about her background, her skills, her experiences during the war. Greshka answered honestly, hiding nothing, and felt the older man's assessment shift as the hours passed. Finally, over coffee in Xander's kitchen, Marcus leaned back in his chair and spoke. I'll be honest, I had my doubts when Xander told me about you. I lost friends to orc war parties, saw things during the fighting that gave me nightmares for months. But I also saw Xander's judgment save lives more than once, and if he says you're trustworthy, that carries weight. He paused. Plus, anyone who can mend a fence that clean and handle sheep, that calmly, clearly knows their way around honest work. I'll speak for you when the trouble comes. Thank you, Greshka said, surprised by the genuine gratitude in her own voice. Don't thank me yet, Marcus said grimly. This is going to get uglier before it gets better. Jacob Morse, the man who came here with those threats, he's got influence in the settlement. People listen to him. You're going to need more than just me and Xander standing with you. He was right. Over the next few days, 2 more neighboring ranchers visited, both veterans who'd served with Xander. One agreed to support them, impressed despite herself by Greshka's knowledge of animal husbandry. The other left shaking his head, unable to overcome his prejudices even in the face of evidence. But it was the 4th visitor who changed everything. She arrived in a wagon, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with silver-threaded hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone accustomed to command. Her name was Eleanor Kirby, and she owned one of the largest ranches in the region, employing dozens of workers and commanding respect throughout the valley. Xander, she said, accepting his help down from the wagon. I've been hearing interesting stories about you lately. Mrs. Kirby, Xander greeted her with obvious respect. Thank you for coming. Eleanor's shrewd gaze found Greshka, who'd been working in the garden and now stood with dirt on her hands and wariness in her eyes. So you're the orc causing such a stir. I am Greshka, she said, lifting her chin and refusing to show submission to this human woman's judgment. I like your spine, Eleanor said approvingly. Too many people these days apologize for their existence before anyone even asks them to. Come here, child. Let me look at you properly. Greshka approached, and Eleanor studied her with the same thoroughness she might give a horse she was considering purchasing. But there was something different in her examination, something that looked past Greshka's green skin and tusks to assess her character. Tell me, Eleanor said finally, why should I risk my reputation and potentially my business to support your relationship with Xander? The blunt question was almost refreshing in its honesty. Because it is right, Greshka said simply. Because judging people by what they are rather than who they are is how wars start. Because Xander is a good man who deserves to be happy, and I make him happy. And does he make you happy? Eleanor asked. Greshka thought of Xander's gentle hands tending her wound, his patient teaching, his quiet strength, the way he'd stood between her and violence without hesitation. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He makes me very happy. Eleanor nodded slowly. Xander's father and my late husband were good friends. I watched Xander grow from a boy into a man, and I've seen him struggle with loneliness since his father passed. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. She turned to Xander. You're serious about this? About her? Completely, Xander said without hesitation. Then you have my support, Eleanor declared. Both of you. And anyone who has a problem with that will have to answer to me personally. She smiled, and it was fierce. I may be an old woman, but I've still got enough influence in this region to make Jacob Morse think twice about his crusade. The relief that washed over Greshka was so intense she felt her knees weaken. Xander caught her elbow, steadying her, and Eleanor pretended not to notice the intimate gesture. With Eleanor's backing, 2 more ranchers agreed to support them, and suddenly the situation didn't look quite so hopeless. But Greshka knew the real test would come when Jacob Morse made good on his threat. It happened exactly 1 week after his first visit, as promised. But instead of 3 men, nearly a dozen arrived at the ranch, all armed with clubs or farming implements, anger written clear on their faces. Greshka saw them coming and rang the bell Xander had installed by the barn, their prearranged signal for trouble. Xander emerged from the house with his rifle, his face set in grim determination. But before the mob could advance onto his property, other riders appeared, coming from multiple directions. Marcus Kendrick and the 2 other veteran ranchers took up positions flanking Xander's house. Eleanor Kirby arrived on her wagon with 3 of her ranch hands, all armed and looking thoroughly unimpressed by the mob. Jacob Morse pulled up short, clearly not having expected resistance. This doesn't concern the rest of you, he called out. This is about Kellerman harboring a monster on his land. Miss Greshka is no monster, Eleanor said sharply, her voice carrying the authority of decades of command. She's a civilian who works hard and bothers no one. If you have a problem with that, Mr. Morse, perhaps you should examine your own prejudices rather than trying to inflict them on others. With respect, Mrs. Kirby, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, Eleanor interrupted. You're a man who needs someone to blame for his troubles, and you've decided an innocent orc woman makes a convenient target. Well, I won't stand for it, and neither will these other good people. Xander Kellerman is a decorated veteran who served this region with honor. If he vouches for Miss Greshka's character, that's good enough for me. She's poisoned him, one of the mob shouted. Can't you see? No right-thinking human would choose an orc over his own kind. Marcus Kendrick spurred his horse forward, placing himself between the mob and the ranch house. I've known Xander Kellerman for 7 years. I've trusted him with my life in combat. When he tells me that Greshka is trustworthy, I believe him, because his judgment has never been wrong. Now you can either turn around and go home, or we can escalate this, but I promise you it won't end the way you're hoping. The standoff held for a long, tense moment. Greshka stood beside Xander, her heart pounding, acutely aware that violence could explode at any second. But she also felt a fierce pride in the people who'd chosen to stand with them, who'd risked their own safety to defend what was right. Finally, Jacob Morse seemed to recognize that he'd badly miscalculated. He looked at the armed ranchers, at Eleanor Kirby's iron expression, at Xander's unwavering stance, and apparently decided this wasn't a fight he could win. This isn't over, he warned, but the words lacked conviction. Yes, it is, Xander said, speaking for the first time since the standoff began, his voice quiet but carrying clearly. You came to my property with threats and violence, and you found that I'm not standing alone. If you're smart, you'll accept that and move on. If you're not smart and you try this again, next time I'll have the sheriff involved and we'll see how he feels about armed mobs threatening peaceful citizens. It wasn't a shout, wasn't even particularly harsh, but there was finality in Xander's tone that made it clear the discussion was over. Jacob Morse glared for another moment, then wheeled his horse around and led his mob away, clearly defeated. When they'd disappeared from sight, Greshka let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Xander set his rifle aside and immediately turned to her, his hands finding hers. Are you all right? He asked, concern evident in his eyes. I am fine, Greshka said, squeezing his hands. Thanks to you. Thanks to all of you, she added, raising her voice to address the others. Eleanor dismounted from her wagon and approached with a businesslike air. Well, that was exciting. Now, I believe we should formalize this situation to somewhat. Xander, you've clearly chosen to build a life with this young woman, and while I support that choice, you need to understand that whispers and rumors will continue unless you make your commitment clear and legal. Xander blinked. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you marry her, you fool, Eleanor said with exasperated affection. Make her your wife in the eyes of the law and the community. It won't stop all the prejudice, but it will make it much harder for people to harass her or try to drive her off. A married woman has legal protections that a hired worker doesn't. The suggestion hung in the air, surprising everyone. Greshka felt her heart leap into her throat. Marriage was a human custom she understood only in the abstract, but the implications were clear. Permanent commitment, legal recognition, a declaration before the world that they belonged to each other. Greshka, Xander said softly, turning to face her fully and ignoring their audience. I know this is sudden, and we haven't talked about this explicitly, but Eleanor's right. More than that, I want this. I want you as my wife, if you'll have me. I want to build a life with you, face whatever comes together, make this official in every way that matters. Greshka looked at this man who'd shown her kindness when she'd had no reason to expect it, who'd defended her without hesitation, who'd never once raised his voice in anger or frustration. She thought about the months of growing affection, the work they'd shared, the future she could see stretching before them if they were brave enough to grasp it. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I will marry you. Xander's face broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen from him, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close while their allies cheered, and Marcus Kendrick whistled appreciatively. Eleanor watched with satisfaction, already making plans. I'll speak to Pastor Williams, she announced. He's a reasonable man, and he owes me several favors. We'll have the ceremony here at the ranch. Make it a proper celebration. Give people something positive to talk about instead of just fear and hatred. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor took charge of organizing the wedding with the same efficiency she brought to running her ranch, bullying the pastor into agreement, arranging for food and supplies, and spreading word throughout the region that anyone who wished to attend would be welcome. Greshka found the whole process overwhelming and strange. Orc unions were typically simple affairs, a declaration before the clan and a sharing of resources, nothing like the elaborate human ceremony being planned. But she also found herself touched by the effort, by the way Eleanor and the other allies threw themselves into making the day special. The most surprising moment came when a small group of women from the settlement appeared at the ranch, carrying a wrapped package. Greshka tensed, expecting trouble, but their leader, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stepped forward with a nervous smile. Miss Greshka, she said, her voice trembling slightly. We heard about the wedding and we wanted to apologize for the way some folks have treated you. Not all of us agree with Jacob Morse and his ilk. We brought you this if you'll accept it. She held out the package, and Greshka unwrapped it to find a beautiful dress, carefully sewn from cream-colored fabric and embroidered with delicate flowers. It was clearly made for a wedding, tailored to fit her larger orc frame, and must have taken days of work. We know you're far from your own people and their customs, the woman continued. We thought you might like to have something special for your day, a welcome of sorts, from those of us who see you as a person rather than an enemy. Greshka found herself blinking back tears, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. Thank you, she managed. This means more than you know. The women smiled, clearly relieved by her acceptance, and stayed for tea, asking curious but respectful questions about orc culture and life. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it felt like the beginning of real bridge building, the first steps toward a future where humans and orcs might coexist peacefully. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, autumn sunlight washing over the ranch in golden waves. Xander had cleaned up the area around the house, setting up benches borrowed from the settlement meeting hall and decorating with fall flowers that Eleanor's staff had gathered. More people showed up than Greshka had expected, nearly 40 guests filling the improvised ceremony space. She dressed in the gifted gown with Eleanor's help, braiding her dark hair with the traditional orc style, but weaving in human flowers as a symbol of the blending of cultures. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the nervous, hungry refugee who'd stumbled onto this ranch 4 months ago. That woman had been running, hiding, waiting for the next attack. This woman stood tall, surrounded by allies, about to marry a man she loved. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. Pastor Williams, clearly uncomfortable but making an effort, spoke about the importance of choosing love over fear, of seeing the humanity or personhood in all beings. Xander stood at the improvised altar, in his best clothes, his eyes never leaving Greshka as she walked toward him, and the expression on his face held such open adoration that Greshka felt her own eyes burn with tears. When it came time for vows, Xander took her hands and spoke in that same quiet voice she'd come to cherish. Greshka, when you walked onto my ranch that morning, I had no idea you'd become the most important person in my life. You've brought joy and purpose to my days, challenged me to be better, and shown me that the strongest bonds are built on respect and partnership rather than force. I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes, to defend you with everything I have, to listen to you with an open heart, and to love you for the rest of my life. Greshka swallowed hard, her own vows feeling inadequate in the face of his eloquence, but she spoke from her heart. Xander, you showed me kindness when I expected only hatred. You taught me that strength does not require volume, that true power lies in patience and integrity. You have given me a home, a purpose, and a love I never dreamed possible. I promise to work beside you, to build this life we are creating together, to honor your gentle heart, and to love you with everything I am. Pastor Williams pronounced them married, and when Xander kissed her, the assembled guests erupted in applause. Greshka heard a few dissenting mutters from the back, but they were drowned out by the overwhelming support from the majority. Marcus Kendrick whistled again, and Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, pretending she wasn't crying. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Greshka had experienced. There was food in abundance, music played on fiddles and guitars, and dancing that went on as the sun set and lanterns were lit. Humans who'd fought against orcs during the war spoke tentatively with Greshka, asking about her experiences, her culture, and seeming genuinely interested in the answers. Children, less burdened by prejudice than their parents, dared each other to approach the orc lady. And Greshka found herself charmed by their curiosity, answering their questions with patient good humor. Xander never left her side, his hand finding hers repeatedly throughout the evening, as though reassuring himself that this was real. When they danced together, Greshka stumbling through the unfamiliar human steps while Xander guided her with gentle patience, she felt completely content for perhaps the first time in her life. As the evening wound down and guests began departing, Eleanor approached the newlyweds with a knowing smile. "You two have done something important here today," she said. "This isn't just about your personal happiness, though that matters. You've shown people that peace between our peoples is possible, that the war doesn't have to define us forever. Don't underestimate the impact of that." After the last guest left, Xander and Greshka stood together on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The ranch stretched out before them, peaceful and productive, a testament to the life they'd built together. "Are you happy?" Xander asked, wrapping an arm around her waist and pulling her close. Greshka leaned into his warmth, marveling at how natural it felt, how right. "More than I ever thought possible," she said honestly. "When I came here, I was just trying to survive. Now I have a home, a purpose, and a husband who I love beyond measure." "Good," Xander said, pressing a kiss to her temple, "because I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." They stood there in comfortable silence for a while, until Greshka voiced the thought that had been nagging at her. "Some people will never accept us," she said quietly. "Jacob Morse and others like him, they will continue to see me as a monster no matter what I do." "You're right," Xander acknowledged, and she appreciated that he didn't try to pretend otherwise. "Some people are too invested in their hatred to change. But you know what? Those people don't matter. What matters is that we have each other. We have allies who see the truth, and we're building something good here. That's enough." Greshka nodded against his shoulder, accepting his words. He was right. They couldn't control how others viewed them, but they could control their own choices, their own actions, their own happiness. The first year of marriage brought its share of challenges. A few neighboring families refused to do business with Xander because of his orc wife, costing him some trade opportunities. Twice more, small groups came to the ranch to cause trouble, though each time they were turned back by the coalition of allies who'd pledged their support. There were moments of frustration, times when Greshka felt like a burden Xander had to defend rather than a partner he'd chosen. But there were far more moments of joy. Learning to navigate married life together, with all its small intimacies and adjustments. Expanding the ranch, adding more cattle, and starting a side business in breeding horses. Hosting gatherings where humans and the few other orcs in the region could meet and socialize, slowly building bridges between the communities. And through it all, Xander remained exactly who he'd been from the beginning. Patient, kind, never raising his voice even in the most stressful moments. When a particularly bad winter killed a dozen cattle and put their finances in jeopardy, he simply assessed the damage and said, "Well, we'll have to tighten our belts for a while, but we'll recover." When Greshka accidentally ruined a week's worth of careful work by miscalculating crop rotation, he just smiled and said, "Mistakes happen. We'll adjust next season." His calm became her anchor, his steady presence the foundation on which she built her new identity. She was no longer just a refugee or a survivor, but Greshka Kellerman, rancher's wife, bridge between cultures, and partner to a man whose quiet strength changed her understanding of what power could be. The real turning point came in their second year together, when word spread through the region that a group of orc refugees, driven out of their settlement by human aggression, were making their way through the area. Most ranches and towns closed their doors, fearful of trouble, but Xander and Greshka opened theirs. 6 orcs arrived at the ranch, 2 families with children, exhausted and desperate. Greshka met them in their own language, offering food and shelter, and felt something in her chest expand when she realized she could provide for others the way Xander had once provided for her. Xander welcomed them without hesitation, finding space in the barn for them to sleep, and immediately setting to work, figuring out how to feed additional mouths. He treated the orc refugees with the same quiet respect he showed everyone, and Greshka watched the visitors' suspicion slowly transform into cautious trust. "You married a human," one of the orc women said to Greshka in their language, her tone making it unclear whether this was accusation or simple observation. "I married a good man," Greshka corrected gently. "His species is far less important than his character." The woman studied Xander, who was showing one of the orc children how to feed the chickens, his patience evident as he explained the process slowly. "He is not what I expected," she admitted. "He is not what anyone expects," Greshka agreed. "That is what makes him special." The refugees stayed for 2 weeks, resting and regaining their strength. In that time, Xander helped them plan their next steps, writing letters of introduction to contacts he had in more tolerant regions, providing supplies for their journey, and never once suggesting that their presence was an imposition. When they left, the gratitude in their eyes was profound. "Thank you," the orc woman told Greshka, "for showing us that not all humans are monsters, for giving us hope." After they'd gone, Greshka found Xander in the stable, checking on a mare who was close to foaling. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her head against his back. "You are an extraordinary man, Xander Kellerman," she said softly. She felt his chuckle rumble through his chest. "I just did what anyone should do. They needed help." "No," Greshka disagreed. "Most people would have turned them away. You welcomed them, helped them, treated them with dignity. You do not even realize how rare that is." Xander turned in her arms, cupping her face in his hands. "I learned from the best," he said simply. "You've taught me as much about strength and resilience as I've supposedly taught you about anything." They kissed there in the stable, surrounded by the soft sounds of animals and hay, and Greshka felt the bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The seasons turned, and their reputation grew. The ranch became known as a safe stop for travelers of all species, a place where prejudice held no power. More families, both human and orc, began settling in the region, drawn by stories of Xander and Greshka's successful partnership. Slowly, incrementally, the culture began to shift. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but rather the steady accumulation of small changes. A merchant who'd previously refused to deal with orcs watched Greshka conduct a business transaction with fairness and competence and reconsidered his stance. A human family whose son had been helped by Greshka when he'd gotten lost in the hills began inviting her to community gatherings. Children who grew up seeing Xander and Greshka working together as equals internalized a different understanding of what was possible. 3 years into their marriage, Eleanor Kirby passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her will left a substantial portion of her land to Xander and Greshka, with a note that read, "For showing this old woman that the future can be brighter than the past, build something beautiful together." The gift expanded their operations significantly and provided the resources to do something Greshka had been dreaming about, establishing a formal sanctuary for refugees regardless of species, a place where those fleeing violence or persecution could find temporary shelter and assistance in relocating. They built additional structures on the new land, set up supply stores, and put out word through their network of allies that the Kellerman Ranch offered safe harbor. The sanctuary saw steady use, with families staying anywhere from a few days to several months while they recovered from trauma and planned their futures. Running the sanctuary alongside the ranch was demanding work, but Greshka thrived on it. She had a gift for making frightened refugees feel safe, for understanding their needs and helping them navigate the complex realities of starting over. Xander supported her efforts completely, taking on extra ranch work so she could focus on the sanctuary, never complaining about the additional burden. One evening, after a particularly long day when they'd settled 3 new families into the sanctuary, Greshka and Xander collapsed together on the porch swing, exhausted but satisfied. Xander's arm draped around her shoulders and Greshka leaned into his warmth. "Do you ever wish for a quieter life?" she asked, thinking of all the complications and work their choices had brought. Xander was quiet for a moment, considering. "No," he said finally. "Sometimes I wish things were easier, that people weren't so quick to hate what they don't understand. But I don't regret any of this. We're making a real difference, helping people who need it. That matters more than ease or quiet." "I love you," Greshka said, the words still feeling momentous even after years of speaking them. "I love you too," Xander replied, kissing the top of her head. "More every day, somehow." They sat there as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and watched the lights come on in the sanctuary buildings where families were settling in for the night. It wasn't the life Greshka had imagined when she'd stumbled onto this ranch 4 years ago, half-starved and desperate. It was better. The following spring brought news that shook the entire region. The capital had passed new legislation officially ending all species-based discrimination and extending full citizenship rights to orcs and other non-human peoples. The war was truly over, at least in a legal sense, though changing hearts and minds would take much longer. To celebrate, the settlement held a festival, and for the first time, Greshka and Xander were invited not as controversial figures to be tolerated, but as respected community members. They attended together, and Greshka felt a surge of pride when humans and orcs alike greeted them warmly, thanking them for the example they'd set and the bridges they'd built. Jacob Morse was there too, standing apart from the main crowd, his face sour with disapproval, but he was alone now, his influence diminished after years of being proven wrong about the orc threat. When his eyes met Greshka's, she saw not hatred but something closer to resignation, as though he'd finally accepted that the world was changing whether he liked it or not. Xander, ever gracious, nodded politely to Morse as they passed, extending a basic courtesy that the other man had never shown him. Morse looked startled, then almost ashamed, and turned away. "You did not have to acknowledge him," Greshka said quietly. "Everyone deserves basic respect." Xander replied with a shrug. "Even people we disagree with, maybe especially them. Hatred only ends when someone chooses not to return it." It was such a quintessentially Xander thing to say, and Greshka felt a rush of affection so strong it made her chest ache. This man, with his gentle ways and unshakable principles, had changed not just her life but the lives of countless others simply by refusing to meet anger with anger, hatred with hatred. The festival was joyful and loud, with music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. Children of multiple species played together without the wariness their parents had carried. Young couples, human and orc, danced together openly, their relationships no longer hidden in shame. It felt like the dawn of something new, something better. As the evening grew late, Xander and Greshka slipped away from the celebration, walking back to their ranch under a sky full of stars. The path was familiar now, worn by years of their footsteps, and Greshka marveled at how much had changed since she'd first walked this road. "What are you thinking about?" Xander asked, noting her contemplative expression. "About that first morning," Greshka said, "when I was so frightened and you offered me breakfast like it was the most natural thing in the world. I thought you might be crazy or setting a trap. I never imagined it would lead to all of this." Xander smiled, that soft expression that still made her heart flutter. "I remember thinking you looked like someone who'd been running for too long and needed a place to stop. I'm glad you stayed." "I could not leave," Greshka admitted. "Not then and not ever. You never raised your voice, not even once. You were patient and kind, and everything I had been told humans could never be. How could I walk away from that?" "Because I saw you," Xander said simply. "Not an orc, not a refugee, not a monster from propaganda posters. Just a person who needed help, who deserved respect and kindness like anyone else." It wasn't complicated, but it had been complicated, Greshka knew. It had required courage and principle and a willingness to stand against social pressure. It had required Xander to be exactly who he was, a man whose father had raised him to judge people by their character, a veteran who'd seen enough violence to value peace, a human being who led with compassion rather than fear. They reached the ranch, and Greshka stood for a moment, taking it all in. The house she'd helped repair and improve, the expanded pastures full of thriving livestock, the sanctuary buildings lit with welcoming lights, the life they'd built together against all odds and expectations. "Thank you," she said, turning to Xander and taking his hands in hers. "For what?" he asked, genuinely confused. "For seeing me," Greshka echoed his earlier words. "For giving me a home when I had none. For standing beside me when it would have been easier to turn me away. For loving me even though the world said you should not. For being you." Xander pulled her close, and they stood there under the stars, wrapped in each other and the quiet certainty of their bond. "You don't need to thank me for any of that," he said softly. "Loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done." They went inside eventually, to the home they'd made together, and Greshka felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead would still have challenges, she knew. Prejudice didn't disappear overnight, and there would always be those who refused to accept the new world taking shape. But they would face it together with patience and principle, and the kind of quiet strength that Xander had taught her was more powerful than any amount of shouting. As they settled in for the night, Greshka thought about all the refugees who'd passed through their sanctuary, all the lives they'd touched, all the small changes they'd helped create. She thought about the children growing up in a world where humans and orcs could live side by side, could fall in love, could build futures together. And she thought about the man sleeping beside her, whose gentle voice and gentler heart had made all of it possible. The next morning dawned bright and clear, promising good weather for the work ahead. Xander woke first, as he usually did, and Greshka listened to him, moving quietly around the house, starting coffee, letting the animals out, beginning his daily routines. She rose and joined him, and they worked side by side in comfortable silence, partners in all things. A rider appeared on the road around mid-morning, and as he drew closer, Greshka recognized one of the young orcs who'd stayed at the sanctuary the previous year. He dismounted with a broad smile, clearly bringing good news. "Greshka, Xander," he called out, "I had to come tell you in person. I got accepted to the agricultural college in the capital. They're starting a program specifically to train farmers in mixed community settlement planning. I wanted to thank you both, because none of this would have been possible without what I learned here." The young orc's joy was infectious, and Greshka felt pride swell in her chest. This was the future they'd been working toward. Young people of all species pursuing education and opportunities that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. They celebrated with the young orc over lunch, asking about his plans and offering advice. When he left, promising to visit during breaks from school, Greshka and Xander returned to their work with renewed energy. We are doing something good here, Greshka observed as they mended a section of fence together. We are, Xander agreed, and we're going to keep doing it for as long as we can. The seasons continued their turning, and the ranch prospered. Word of the sanctuary spread further, bringing not just refugees but also scholars and activists interested in studying their model of interspecies cooperation. Greshka found herself giving talks at regional gatherings, sharing her experiences and advocating for policies that would protect vulnerable populations. It was strange and sometimes uncomfortable to be seen as a leader and spokesperson, but Xander supported her completely, encouraging her to use her voice while handling more of the daily ranch operations himself. They were a true partnership, each playing to their strengths, supporting each other's weaknesses. 5 years after that first desperate morning when Greshka had stumbled onto the ranch, the regional council invited her and Xander to speak at a peace commemoration ceremony. They stood before a crowd of hundreds, humans and orcs and other species represented, and Greshka felt the weight of the moment. When it was her turn to speak, she stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled crowd. 5 years ago, I walked onto a stranger's property, expecting to be chased away at best, attacked at worst, she began, her voice carrying clearly. Instead, I found a man who offered me breakfast and asked what I needed. That simple act of kindness changed my life, and in many ways, it has changed this entire region. She glanced at Xander, standing just behind her, and drew strength from his supportive presence. My husband has never raised his voice, not in anger or frustration or fear. He leads with patience and principle, showing that true strength requires no volume. He has taught me that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the willingness to meet conflict with compassion instead of violence. And if we want to build a better future for all our peoples, we must follow that example. The crowd applauded, and Greshka stepped back to let Xander take his turn. He spoke briefly, uncomfortable as always with public attention, but his words were powerful in their simplicity. We're all just people trying to live our lives with dignity and purpose, he said. Species doesn't change that fundamental truth. The sooner we all accept it, the better off we'll all be. After the ceremony, as they made their way back to their wagon through a crowd of well-wishers, an elderly orc woman stopped Greshka. My granddaughter wants to marry a human boy, the woman said, her lined face creased with worry. I told her about you and your husband, how you made it work. She wants to know if it is truly possible. Greshka took the woman's gnarled hands in her own. It is possible, she said with absolute certainty. It is not always easy, and there will be people who disapprove. But if the love is real and the commitment is strong, it is absolutely possible. Tell your granddaughter to be brave and to choose a partner who treats her with respect and kindness. Everything else will follow. The woman's eyes filled with tears of relief, and she squeezed Greshka's hands. Thank you, child. You have given us all hope. On the ride home, Greshka was quiet, processing the day's emotions. Xander drove the wagon with his usual calm competence, not pushing her to talk, but making his presence known if she needed it. I never wanted to be a symbol, Greshka finally said. I just wanted a home, a partner, a life. But somehow we have become this thing that people look to for hope and guidance. It feels like a heavy responsibility. It is, Xander acknowledged, but you carry it well, and you don't have to carry it alone. He reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. We're in this together, remember? Whatever comes next, we face it as a team. Greshka squeezed his hand, drawing comfort from his touch and his words. Together, she agreed. The years that followed brought continued growth and change. The sanctuary expanded to include educational programs, teaching refugees trades and skills that would help them integrate into their new communities. Greshka hired staff, both human and orc, to help manage the operations, freeing up some of her time to focus on advocacy work. Xander took on an apprentice, a young human man who wanted to learn ranching and who benefited greatly from Xander's patient teaching style. They hosted their first interspecies wedding on the ranch, officiating as friends of the couple, stood witness to vows that mirrored their own. It was a beautiful ceremony, made more powerful by the knowledge that such a thing would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. On their 7th anniversary, Xander surprised Greshka with a gift, a beautifully carved wooden sign for the main road leading to their property. It read Kellerman Ranch and Sanctuary, all welcome here in both human and orcish script. I wanted something that made our principles clear, Xander explained as they stood together admiring the sign, so anyone approaching knows what kind of place this is. Greshka traced the orcish letters with her fingertips, moved beyond words. That Xander had taken the time to have the message translated to ensure that orcs would feel explicitly welcomed spoke volumes about his character and his commitment to their shared vision. "It is perfect," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "You are perfect." "Far from it," Xander said with a self-deprecating smile, "but I try. And I have an excellent partner who makes me want to be better." They stood there together as the sun set, casting long shadows across the land they'd claimed and cultivated, and Greshka felt a completeness that she'd never known was possible. This ranch, this life, this love, it was everything she'd never dared to dream of during those desperate days of running from town to town. The seasons turned again, and life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and right. There were still challenges, still moments of prejudice and difficulty, but they faced each obstacle with the same patience and partnership that had carried them through the early days. A particularly meaningful moment came when Jacob Morse, the man who'd once threatened them with a mob, appeared at the ranch asking for help. His own farm had fallen on hard times after a series of bad harvests, and he'd exhausted his other options. He stood at their door, hat in hand, struggling visibly with the humiliation of asking aid from those he'd once tried to drive away. Xander invited him in without hesitation, offered him coffee, and listened to his situation with the same courtesy he'd show anyone. "We can spare some seed for your spring planting," he said, after Morse had explained his circumstances. "And if you need advice on soil management, Greshka has become quite the expert." Morse looked at Greshka with something like shame in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said gruffly. "For the things I said, the things I did. I was wrong about you, about all of this. I let fear and anger guide me instead of reason." It was a hard-won apology, clearly difficult for the proud man to make. Greshka considered him for a long moment, then nodded. "Fear makes us do things we regret," she said quietly. "But acknowledging that and trying to do better is what matters. We will help you." They gave Morse the supplies he needed and sent him on his way with genuine good wishes for his success. After he'd left, Xander wrapped an arm around Greshka's waist and kissed her temple. "You're more forgiving than I would have been," he observed. "I learned it from you," Greshka replied. "You forgave me every mistake I made when I was learning to work this ranch. You forgave those who doubted us at first but eventually came around. Forgiveness is stronger than grudges. When did you become so wise?" Xander asked, his tone affectionate and teasing. "When I married a man who showed me what wisdom looks like," Greshka answered, leaning into his embrace. 8 years after that first desperate morning, Greshka woke to find Xander already up, standing on the porch and watching the sunrise. She joined him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the early morning chill. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Just thinking," Xander replied, slipping an arm around her and pulling her close. "About how much has changed since you walked up that road. About how different my life would be if you'd kept walking that morning instead of taking a chance as on accepting from a stranger." "I could not keep walking," Greshka said, echoing words she'd spoken years before. "You never raised your voice, not even once. That is why I could not leave your ranch. Because I had never met anyone like you, and I knew instinctively that this place, this person, was worth the risk of staying." "Best decision you ever made?" Xander asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. "Best decision I ever made," Greshka confirmed without hesitation. "You gave me everything, Xander. A home, a purpose, a love that sustains me through every difficulty. You showed me that the world can be better than I feared, that people can choose kindness over cruelty." "We showed each other," Xander corrected gently. "I'm a better man because of you, Greshka. You've taught me about resilience and courage. You've pushed me to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. This life we've built, it's ours, together." They stood there in the growing light, watching their ranch come to life around them. Smoke rose from the sanctuary buildings where refugee families were starting their days. Cattle lowed in the distance, calling to be fed. Birds sang their morning songs, oblivious to the momentous nature of human and orcish partnership that had once seemed impossible. "What do you think the future holds?" Greshka asked, leaning her head against Xander's shoulder. More work, Xander said pragmatically. More challenges, probably. More refugees who need help, more prejudice to overcome, more reasons to keep fighting for the world we want to see. He paused, then added softly, and more mornings like this, with you beside me. That's what makes it all worthwhile. Greshka turned in his arms, rising on her toes to kiss him properly. It was the kind of kiss that still held passion after years together, but also comfort and familiarity, the intimate knowledge of loving and being loved completely. When they broke apart, Xander smiled at her, that gentle expression that had first captured her heart. Ready to face another day, he asked. With you? Greshka replied. Always. They went inside together to start breakfast, to begin the routines that structured their days, to continue building the life they'd chosen against all odds and expectations. And as they worked side by side in comfortable partnership, Greshka felt grateful beyond measure for the twist of fate that had brought her to this ranch, to this man, to this beautiful, complicated, thoroughly worthwhile life. The story of how an orc woman had been unable to leave a ranch because its owner never raised his voice had become something of a legend in the region, retold and embellished with each telling. But the simple truth was more powerful than any embellishment. Genuine kindness, quiet strength, and unwavering principle had created a bond that transcended species and prejudice, building something that would endure for all their days. And that, Greshka thought as she watched Xander crack eggs for their breakfast, humming softly under his breath, was the greatest gift of all. Not the ranch, not the sanctuary, not even the social change they'd helped create, important as those things were. The greatest gift was finding someone whose soul complemented her own, whose gentle nature balanced her fierce protectiveness, whose quiet voice spoke louder than any shout ever could. I love you, she said, the words as natural as breathing now. Xander looked up from the stove, his face lighting with that smile reserved just for her. I love you too, he replied. Today, tomorrow, and all the days after that. And in the warm kitchen of the ranch that had become her home, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together, Greshka knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, living exactly the life they were meant to share. The end of their beginning, and the beginning of everything else.